Hey Vinyl community, for this video I wanted to talk about bands whose final studio album of new material was arguably the best album that they ever recorded. And there aren't too many bands I think that you could argue that is the case for. Usually what happens with bands is they either continue to put out albums well past the point that they should. U2 is an example, REM is an example, and the quality of their studio albums just keeps diminishing and diminishing, or it's just flat mediocre. Bands just keep putting out mediocre albums. They're not great, they're not necessarily awful, but they're just kind of treading water. Artistically, there's not any growth, and the quality of their albums either drops or stays the same. And so the bands that I am going to be showing today, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list, these are just the bands that I could think of, bands that I had in my collection and bands that I could just think of whose final studio album of new recorded material was, or you could argue, was the best album that they ever recorded. And obviously fans of these bands are gonna disagree. You can't even get fans of any one band to agree on what their best album was, but I'm just saying for these particular albums, you could make the argument that this was the best album of their entire catalog. So the first album that I'm going to show, and because I'm a Beatles fan, this is a no-brainer. I'm going to talk about Abbey Road. Now, Abbey Road was technically the last album of newly recorded studio material that the Beatles put out. Let It Be was released a year later or several months later. However, that material had been recorded in January of 1969, which was over a year before the Beatles actually announced their breakup. So to me, Abbey Road has always been their final studio album, and it is such a great album. I think most Beatles fans would agree it is one of their best, if not the best album the Beatles ever put out. There's a large majority of Beatles fans who I think consider this the best thing that the Beatles ever did. So I got to put Abbey Road here on the list for sure. The next one I'm going to show is Led Zeppelin's final studio album. This was In Through the Outdoor. And Led Zeppelin purists, many of them will say, well, how could you say that? Obviously, it's got to be one of their earlier 70s albums. But there is a contingency of Led Zeppelin fans who I think believe this album is their strongest. You could definitely make the argument for it. It should be in the conversation. It's got In the Evening on it, which is a classic Led Zeppelin track, Fool in the Rain, All My Love. I love the blues track, I'm Gonna Crawl. Even the big hits off this album, kind of the deeper album tracks on here, like Carousel Alhambra, Southbound Soares, or Soiree, however you pronounce that, Soiree, however you pronounce, whatever it's called, is a great track. Even Hot Dog has its charm. So I'm gonna put this on my list because I think this was definitely one of the best albums Led Zeppelin ever put out, and it was their last one. Sticking with classic rock, The Doors, LA Woman. Now, to me, The Doors was always Jim Morrison, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore. I know the surviving members of The Doors put out 2 albums after Jim Morrison passed away, but that's not really The Doors. The Doors ended, unfortunately, when Jim Morrison died, and this was the last album that they put out before that happened. It's a classic. It might be the best album The Doors ever recorded. How can you argue with an album that has LA Woman, Riders on the Storm, Love Her Madly? You've got some great blues tracks here, like Crawling King Snake, The Wasp, Cars Hiss by My Window, Been Down So Long. I mean, this is just such a classic album, and I don't know how you couldn't argue it was one of the Doors' greatest, if not the greatest. Gonna switch gears a little bit and get into a little different style of music. This is Roxy Music, their final album from 1983. 82 or 83, I believe it was. But this was kind of the synthesis of everything that Phil Manzanera, Andy McKay, and Brian Ferry had been working towards. It is such a great pop rock masterpiece, new wave classic, whatever you want to call it, but it's got more than this on it. It's got the title track, Avalon, Take a Chance with Me, To Turn You On, so many great tracks on here. And probably Roxy music purists would say, well, it's obviously an album from the Brian Eno era would be their best album ever, but this was one of the first Roxy music albums that I ever got into. It sounds as fresh today as it did when it was released, and I think you could definitely argue that Avalon was the best album Roxy Music ever put out. And I'm sure if you don't agree, you'll leave a comment and tell me so and set me straight. But I'm just telling you, it should be in the conversation. The Smiths' final album, Strange Ways, Here We Come. The Smiths had a short life. I think it was around 4 or 5 years. They were actually on the scene and putting out albums, but this, their final album, is as classic as they come. A Rush and a Push and The Land Is Ours, I Started Something I Couldn't Finish, Girlfriend in a Coma, Unhappy Birthday, Stop Me If You've Heard This One Before, Death at One's Elbow. So many great tracks on here. I think you could definitely argue that this was the best album that the Smiths ever put out, but I'll leave more hardcore Smiths fans to sort that one out. I'm just saying, again, you could make the case. And I'm not talking, again, you know, anybody could make a case that any given band's album was, their final album was great and a classic, but I'm not talking about the 1% of Clash fans who think Cut the Crap is great. I'm not talking about the 1% of fans who think that Mardi Gras was the best album Creedence Clearwater Revival ever put out. I mean, there's going to be those fans who always say that. Now, I could make a case, if I wanted to, that Dire Straits' final album, On Every Street, was a great album, a bona fide classic. You could argue. I could argue that it was their best album. I'm not going to, because I know I would be outvoted. I'm in a small minority of people who consider that Dire Straits' greatest album. And I'm not even saying I do, but I know there are fans out there. I'm sure there are a Dire Straits fan out there who think On Every Street was the greatest album Dire Straits ever put out. But I'm not including it on this list because, by and large, you would have a hard time making that argument to a lot of hardcore Dire Straits fans. So I'm just trying to set the criteria out there, the bar that I use to rate these albums. So next album, having gotten that out of the way, the next album I want to show is The Police, Synchronicity, their final album. They went out on such a high note. And say what you will about the fact that, okay, these songs have been overplayed on the radio. Synchronicity 2, Every Breath You Take, King of Pain, Wrapped Around Your Finger, heard it so many times, I never want to hear this album again. It is still one of the Police's greatest albums. It is their bestseller, and I believe there are a large number of Police fans out there who think that this is the Police's greatest album. You could make that argument. It's part of the conversation, so that's why I'm putting it on this list. Now, the last one that I have to show is Nirvana, In Utero. Unfortunately, Nirvana broke up after the death of Kurt Cobain by suicide, but of their 3 studio albums, you could argue that this was the best one. It's got Scentless Apprentice on it, Heart-Shaped Box, No Apologies, Dumb, so many great tracks on here. It really is considered a classic. And again, they went out on a high note. Unfortunately, not so much a high note because of the way their career ended. But I'm just saying, as a band, this could be easily regarded as their best album. Now, one that I don't have to show, but I know is very thought of very highly and rated very highly by fans of this band. I'm talking about ABBA, The Visitors. I do not have this album, but I know there are ABBA fans who will tell you that The Visitors is the best thing that ABBA ever did. Probably most ABBA fans would argue that. So I wanted to include that even though I don't have that album to show, but I am sure there are many bands out there who fit this criteria, whose last studio album they recorded, and I'm not talking, well, the last album Pearl Jam recorded was great. No, I'm saying the band broke up, they're never getting back together, or it's very unlikely they will ever get back together, and their final studio album was maybe the best thing they ever did. So maybe you agree with my list. Maybe you've got some to add. I'm sure there are bands that I am just not thinking of at the moment. I thought about Talking Heads, but I don't think Naked is all that great of an album. And, you know, there are other bands I'm sure who come to mind. But, you know, again, bona fide classic. Hard to argue that it wasn't. So anyway, I'm throwing it out there. I was just thinking about that today, and let me know what you think in the comments, or, you know, if you think I forgot something, let me know.